American Rescue Plan and how these programs and these services can be of benefit to the broader arts community is being presented to you in partnership with Americans for the Arts and the Arts Action Fund. We want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. No matter where you are, it might be sunny, it might be cold. We want you to take out those pencils, get your computers ready to take some notes. If you have to snuggle in to stay warm, do so. Turn on a fan to cool off, do so. But plan on staying with us. There's so much information, and we don't want you to miss a bit of it. We're going to take just a few moments to allow folks to get online. So let me offer a quick introduction. My name is Joy Young. I'm president. Don't I wish I were? I fooled you. I'm vice president of programs at South Arts. I'd like to take a moment to welcome our CEO and president, Susie Serkimer. Susie has had a long time presence in the arts here in the South and nationally. For 9 years, Susie has been our president and CEO. She's led South Arts to achieve exponential growth, particularly in service to individual artists, arts organizations, and rural communities. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you Susie Serkimer, our president and CEO of South Arts.
Thank you, Joy. I really appreciate that. And it's a delight to be here today. Thank you, Nina and AFTA, for being willing to provide this information and this webinar for our constituents. So as Joy said, my name is Susie Serkimer, President and CEO of South Arts. Joy mentioned that we have been changing at South Arts, and that is very true. We are in a period of rapid growth. We're broadening our reach into new artistic disciplines and communities. We are introducing new programs such as these webinars, and we've learned from the pandemic that we are more nimble than ever, able to respond quickly to changes in our cultural environment. At South Arts, our mission is advancing Southern vitality through the arts. We have 5 goals, and I'm just going to sort of synopsize them today. They're all about raising the visibility of the arts. We work with artists and arts organizations to help make them more successful. We connect and convene people, organizations, and resources to one another so they can do their work more collaboratively and effectively. We try to understand the needs of Southern communities and show them how their challenges can be addressed through the arts. We build partnerships that help us find the resources and connections we need to advance Southern vitality through the arts. And we represent the South at the national level to make sure Southern artists and arts organizations are at the table for national conversations. So that's a brief overview of South Arts. I want to encourage you to take full advantage of this American Rescue Plan, and Nina's going to tell you how to do that. So I don't want to take any more time. We need to get towards her. So Joy, I will turn it back over to you. Welcome, and we're so glad you're with us today.
Thank you, Susie. So wanted to share some opportunities that you can tap into right now, as well as us getting to Nina so you can learn about other opportunities. So visit our website, www.southarts.org. And once you get there, you'll see a 3-bar tab in the right-hand corner, and you can look up the details of these 4 grant opportunities I'm going to share with you. The first are presentation grants. These are grants of up to $7,500 for organizations to present a Southern artist for performing arts, literary arts, visual arts, or film. Express grants for rural communities is another opportunity. And these are grants specifically set aside for rural communities. Then we have opportunities for individual artists. This opportunity can be found with Jazz Road Tours. This provides up to $15,000 to jazz artists anywhere in the United States to build tours. And finally, our professional development grant opportunities offer up to $1,000 to support professional development for arts professionals. So again, visit our website to learn more. So about today's webinar, this is a webinar. You can see us, but we can't see you. There is a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. There's this box where you can enter your question. There's a gentleman named Ivan who is our technical producer. He will capture as many questions as possible so that we can all benefit from the answers. Similar or repetitive questions will be combined so that we can get as much bang for our buck in answering questions. And here's Ivan letting everyone know. Finally, as these opportunities are being presented to you, know that there are two main things you're going to have to do to tap into our opportunities at South Arts as well as with the federal opportunities. You're going to have to register for SAMs for your federal opportunities, and Nina's going to talk about that, but we're going to make sure you get the link for registering for SAMs. And you're also going to need a DUNS number, a Data Universal Numbering System, or a DUNS number. Again, we will send you that information just to make sure that you can get off this webinar and get yourself registered. Now to the good stuff. Nina. Nina Ozlu Tunceli is the Chief Counsel of Government, is from the Office of Government Affairs and Public Affairs with Americans for the Arts. And she's an Executive Director for the Arts Action Fund. Nina is an arts warrior. She has for over 27 years used every tool of politics to ensure arts access and funding availability for every community in the United States. During the pandemic, Nina and the entire team of Americans for the Arts have been staunch allies, ensuring the inclusion of the arts in both rescue and now recovery. We are pleased that she's taking time to share her knowledge and insights to us here in the Southern region. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Nina. And Nina, again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Joy. Thank you, Susie Serkimer. I've known Susie for 20 years probably. And Ivan, thank you for all the technical support. Joining me today is my assistant, Morgan Fornari, who's going to help advance the slides. Speaking of slides, let's go ahead and put them up. We have a lot of content for you today. I've been asked to go over all the components of the American Rescue Plan, from how it impacts individuals to organizations to government entities, and the subgranting that might come from other governmental entities. All federal resources coming down to the state and local level and individual level. All of the links that I'm going to be talking about are located on a hub that we have everything located on, and that's the URL that you're looking at right now, artsactionfund.org/COVID-19 resources. Everything that I'm going to talk about is there today. All the citations and URLs that I leave are going to be listed individually also there. And probably the best news for you is we have already posted the slides for the South Arts webinar that we're doing right now on this website. You can see it. It'll be dated 3/31/21. So relax. You can just take in the information and the slides will be available to you. And then South Arts is recording this webinar. And they'll post it within the first 48 hours so that you can hear any additional information that I might give verbally that's not on the slide. So let's move on to the next slide. So what I am going to do is first go over things that impact you individually, and we're going to start with the stimulus checks. Now, according to the news and the IRS, the great majority of you should have received your economic stimulus check by now. And this is all stemming from what is called the American Rescue Plan. It's $1.9 trillion, and that's T trillion, not billion, of both economic stimulus support and health relief programs, like making sure all of the vaccines are completely free to everybody. You don't need insurance. Making sure that if you do get COVID, all of your hospital bills are taken care of by the federal government. You do not have even a copay for that one, and you do not need insurance. That's what you get in this current American Rescue Plan. It was signed into law March 11th, and it builds on the original programs that were passed in 2020 called the CARES Act and Economic Aid Act. But there are some new pieces in here too. So let's go to the next slide. And I was just about to talk about that economic stimulus. So the great majority of you, it's going out to about 159 million households. As I understand it, over 100 million households have already received their checks through a direct deposit. The goal was to get it there by the end of this month. If for any reason you haven't gotten it, it's probably because you do not have a checking account number associated with your tax return. So perhaps you've not gotten refunds in the past, or you haven't requested those refunds be given to you as a direct deposit. For those of you who are in that category who have a checking account online with them, you would have gotten your debit, your stimulus checks as a debit as a credit into your accounts within days of March 11th, and many people did. Others are going to have to get it snail mail, and the post office isn't doing very well these days, so you're going to probably get it a little bit later than you expect. For those of you who rely only on Social Security income and don't even file a tax return, don't worry. The IRS coordinates with the Social Security office to get your direct deposit information for your Social Security checks, and they're going to use the exact same ones to get you your stimulus. So how much are you going to get, and how is it different from previous stimulus checks that you've gotten? Previously, back in April, there was $1,200 checks per person under a certain AGI. In December, it was $600. And now we have $1,400 maximum per taxpayer, but not every taxpayer. You will start to phase out in receiving any kind of a stimulus if your adjusted gross income is $75,000 or less based on your last filed tax return. So for most people, that's your 2019 tax return. If you had your 2020 tax return filed before March 11th, and if, let's say, you had a baby in January of 2020, it really would have been to your benefit to file your tax returns before March 11th, because they would have used that as the amount of money that you qualify for, and you would have gotten $1,400 for your baby. Where do you find your adjusted gross income? Well, your tax returns have changed considerably in the last couple of years. So just to make sure you know what line to look for, you go to your 1040 and you look on line 8B. And that's where you'll find what's called your AGI, adjusted gross income. And it quickly phases out just $5,000 later up to $80,000. And at that point you get zero. And that's if you're a single taxpayer. If you're a head of household taxpayer, which means you're single, but you have children that are dependent on you, or adults that are even dependent on you, you get the same $1,400, but your income can go up as high as $112,500 before it phases out. And then if you're married and filing jointly, and that's key, you have to file jointly to get this benefit, you'll get $1,400 each, which is $2,800, if your AGI doesn't exceed $150,000. So what's different than previous stimulus checks is that the phase out is much quicker. And this has a lot to do with Senator Manchin of West Virginia, who wanted to make sure people who really needed it were getting the money. And so that's why he wanted that phase out to happen much faster. It phased out over $25,000 in previous stimulus checks, and now it only phases out between $5,000 and $10,000. So what is a positive, very positive thing on this one is the amount of stimulus check each dependent gets. in the prior to stimulus checks, if your child that's a dependent that you claim is under 17 years old by the time you filed your tax return, not the time that you get the money, but the time you filed your tax return. If they were under 17, you would get the full amount for that dependent. They cap the number of dependents that you could have. Now, unlimited number of dependents. There is no age limit. So your college age kids can also be qualified to get the $1,400 as long as, one, they don't complete their own tax return and say they are not a dependent. They are not dependent on someone else. So they have to remain your dependent. That's key. Second is if you have elderly or if you have older kids that are disabled, perhaps, that are still living with you, all of them can be included as long as on your tax return you claim them as a dependent in your last tax return. Let's go to the next slide. So if you are one of these folks who still did not get your check and you're curious how much you're going to get, I've left on the left side, I've given you a really easy calculator to figure out how much your return will be. So you can go to that URL to figure out how much you think you're due. Of course, you're going to need that 1040 number on the line that I gave you for AGI. And then you're going to pop over to a different URL, which is the IRS's URL, to find out, when am I going to get this check? And you'll put in some very basic information that has to match what your tax return, your last known tax return is. If it doesn't match, it's not going to work. So be sure to have that 1040 in front of you. And that is going to give you information about when and how they're going to send you the money. They don't tell you how much you're going to get, though, but they do tell you what method, or if there's a problem also, they'll tell you that. Next slide, please. So the other big thing that, and this is really helpful for those of you with kids, and this one is age dependent because it's the child earned income credit for tax year 2021. This is really a really great deal because President Biden wanted to really kind of reverse the trends of child poverty, but also benefited for lots of families as well. So he has increased the amount per child that tax filers who are parents can get for their children under the age of 18. So, and it's again, based on when the last tax return was filed. So if you have some children who are under the age of 18, the tax credit has gone from $2,000 to $3,000 per child. That can mean a lot. And if your child is under the age of 6, the actual value is $3,600. So that's a considerable amount of money instead of $3,000. You have very similar threshold points, but the phase out is much higher. It's not just after $5,000 you get nothing. So you can see in the next bullet, it begins with the same amounts in terms of how much the maximum you can make AGI to get the maximum for your child tax credit, but it phases out much later on. And then the other thing that's different is that this is a tax credit for this year, 2021, not retroactively for 2020. So Biden wants to get this money into people's hands as fast as possible. So what's going to happen is you are going to get an advance payment. Usually what these things are reconciled on your tax return. So you wouldn't have normally seen this money until you completed your tax return in 2022, but now you're going to get it quickly in 2021, so you can get the money you need now. So the first half, the federal government through the IRS is going to figure out how much you are owed based on what you've claimed as dependents on your previous tax return. And they're going to send you half by the end of June of what you're owed for your child tax credit. They're going to send the second half when in monthly payments to you on so that it's almost like you're getting a monthly allowance for your children and their overhead costs, and that will be the balance of what's owed to you. Next slide, please. So another thing that's important for individuals is the ability to still claim pandemic unemployment assistance if you need it. And it was, if this had not passed, the pandemic unemployment assistance was going to end on March 14th. This bill was signed into law on March 11th, so it was in the nick of time. And what it does is it advances and extends unemployment assistance, both state and the extra federal, all the way through Labor Day, September 6th. It also extended the weekly amount that you get on top of what you qualify for your state amount. And the federal government's going to add another $300, and that also gets extended to September 6th. Also, every state has a limit on how many weeks you can do state unemployment. This American Rescue Plan also extended that maximum limit of how long you can stay on state unemployment, and the federal government is going to subsidize the state for their state portion. And it also guaranteed unemployment for those who need it, who are self-employed individuals, 1099 workers. So typically, unemployment is just for W-2 workers who have been laid off. They were quote unquote employees of a company. And 1099 workers and self-employed workers are not covered under the unemployment insurance system, nor have they ever paid into it. But since the pandemic back in April, gig workers have been able to participate, and it's been a godsend. Billions of dollars have been able to get to self-employed individuals who have not been able to get work because of the shutdowns. So that also is guaranteed to be extended to September 6th. You'll need to make sure you do your weekly certifications. I know a lot of states will have some hiccups during this period, and they did every time there was an extension because they have to update their web portals. If you go a couple weeks without an unemployment check, but you still certified those weeks, don't worry, you will get a retroactive check for that, and that can be good too, as long as you can hold out during those weeks. The other thing that was very important this year, and it also is important that's retroactive to 2020, and it will happen in 2021, is that the first $10,200 of unemployment money that you received in 2020, it was subject to both federal and state taxes. And many of you had that money taken out of your weekly unemployment checks. And what the American Rescue Plan does now is it says that the federal portion of the taxes only, many states are going to continue to tax you on your unemployment, but the federal government has chosen to not tax the first $10,200 of your unemployment money in 2020 and in 2021. So how do you get back that money for 2020 that you already paid out? If you did, many of you did, you have a choice when you get your unemployment and they ask you, do you want your taxes taken out? Most people do. Some states don't give you a choice and they just take it out. So if you are in this scenario where it was taken out, it does not mean you get $10,200. It just means the federal taxes that were taken out on $10,200. So I'm guessing it's going to be about 10%. So it's somewhere around $1,000, I think, that you might be able to get back. And since 2020 is already over, there are two ways you can do it. One is when you go to, if you haven't completed your tax return for 2020 yet, be sure to get the most updated form, whether you're using a service like TurboTax or one of the others, or you're going on to the IRS's website to get the form and filling it out on paper. Just be sure you're getting the most updated form so that it has a new section in there for you to be able to claim and get the money back and credit it to you of money that was already taken out. If you already completed your tax return and already made the payments for the first $10,200, the IRS is going to reconcile this on your behalf automatically without you requesting it. And after they get through all the stimulus checks, they are going to go back and look to see who this applied to. And they are going to send you a check or make an automatic debit for the credit on that tax. And moving forward in 2021, you have a choice. Do you want them to take money out for your federal taxes for the first $10,200, or do you want to reconcile it at the end? It's up to you. And then I just want to remind people, and we're going to get to PPP in a moment, but I just want to remind everyone that when you are on unemployment, if you are, say, a gig worker or an entrepreneur who has their own business, you want to make sure you are not taking your PPP funds and paying yourself during the covered period while you're on unemployment. You can't do both at the same time. So, but you can stagger it. So, you know, you can jump off unemployment for 8 weeks and then you can get back on it if you still need the assistance. Let's go to the next slide. Susie, I think you need to mute your video because we're hearing some sounds off of your mic. Okay, thank you, Susie. Okay, so also in the American Rescue Plan are additional subsidies that are quite good for keeping your health insurance and making sure that you have a policy that you can use if you get ill. So one is for all those W-2 workers who were on an employer's health insurance who would be entitled to COBRA after they were either laid off or lost their job or some other reason they're just not able to be employed anymore. They would normally have a COBRA plan to keep that policy moving. It's usually expensive. And what this American Rescue Plan is doing is that it is covering 100% of those COBRA costs for those individuals who are no longer affiliated with their employer. And they will do it on a monthly basis from April 2021 all the way through September, because the anticipation is that after September, the country is going to be back open and running, knock on wood. And then for those of you who were never part of a COBRA employment-based health insurance plan and you were going through the ACA exchange, the federal government is going to increase the amount of subsidy that you can get so that you're really paying minimal amount. And for those of you who are under a certain salary level, even with your self-employment, and certainly if you're on unemployment, you're going to get 100% of it covered, which is in the third bullet. I think that you're going to see a really welcome amount in terms of how little you have to pay for your health insurance on the ACA exchange beginning in April. Next slide, please. Rental and mortgage assistance, also important for individuals who need the help. Over $21 billion is being given to your state and local governments to give to you. So you don't apply to the federal government for this kind of assistance. You have to go through your state and local governments who have been given money from the federal government to provide rent and utility cost assistance to eligible families who are at risk of who haven't paid and they're at risk of being thrown out of their premises, or the mortgage company is going to foreclose on their mortgage and on their home. There's money that has now been made available. So you want to seek out, I can't possibly provide it for all the states, but every state will have some kind of assistance program because they're getting the money from the federal government. So check it out. And if you have someone you know that's important to you who is homeless or at risk of being homeless, there's money in there for them as well to make sure they have shelter. Next slide, please. So that comprises a lot of the support for individuals. There are a few other things for sure, but these are the ones that are directly, helping you and your family. This next area is probably one of the largest areas that was in the American Rescue Plan. And it was something that your state and local governments needed. Now, we saw money going through your state and local governments for that rental assistance, healthcare kind of stuff, but that's pass-through money for the most part. This is now money that your state and local governments can do a few things with. One, they can use it for helping their own city, state government systems, because you got to remember, they have not been receiving much tax revenue, whether it be through sales tax or income tax because of the shutdown. So they are in need as well to make sure that they can keep their employees intact. But there's a lot of extra in here too, to do some infrastructure projects. There's a lot extra in there to re-grant out for economic relief to small businesses, to artists. We know that many states gave it out to various state arts agencies or to other kinds of state agencies, service agencies, to re-grant to small businesses that they have interactions with. The same thing happened at the local level. For those large cities, they got direct grants, and for smaller cities, the money goes to the state and then it's given to more smaller counties, cities, and rural towns so that they have money to distribute locally as well. This has turned out to be, even with the CARES Act that went out, which was only $150 billion, to give you a sense, this is almost 3 times bigger, but it's going to last for a longer period of time. CARES Act lasted for 8 months into 2000, all the way through 2020. Now in December, it got extended another year, but most states and local governments had already spent their money. This one, they're getting $350 billion and they can use it all the way through 2024. So there's a possibility of even getting some multi-year grants for small businesses and artists and things like that. So how does it work? Let's go to the next slide. Okay, of the money that's going out to states, at least 50% of it has to be distributed no later than 60 days from enactment, March 11th, so that it starts getting distributed, it goes really fast. And then the states, there was a delay last year and they weren't getting it out to those smaller communities fast enough. So now each state is required to get it out to these smaller towns that are, and smaller towns is quite big still. I mean, it's like larger than smaller than 350,000 population. So that's a lot of cities and towns. The states are going to have to get it to them within 30 days of them receiving the funds. So this money is going to move very, very quickly. A town, because we're talking about a lot of money, the one thing you have to realize is that for a small town, they cannot receive more than 75% of their own annual budget in 2020. So there's a possibility of a huge infusion of cash. And the reason why I'm talking to you about it is because you want to be at the policy table in advocating how they use the funds. And that's what's key here. And I'm going to be showing you examples of a lot of arts groups that use it for really creative ways. The great bulk of the money, the $195 billion, after other parts are taken out, is the part that is going to all the states and the District of Columbia. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, if you can go back one slide, Morgan. I want to point out the thing that is in that red where it says 169. So there is a formula of how the money's distributed. At least 500 million goes to every state and DC. But then what's left is 169 billion. And that's done with a little bit more strategic evaluation. It's not just based on population, which is what something like CDBG, Community Development Block Grants, are based on. This is based on the share of unemployed workers in your state during a certain period, and that's October to December 2020. So those states that are harder hit, let's say they stayed closed longer because they wanted to pay attention to what the science was saying on the pandemic, they are going to have more unemployed people as a percentage than, say, states that stayed open longer, where people continued with business. So keep that in mind also in terms, each state's still going to get a lot of money. It's just that some states might get more because, let's say, they followed the science rules. Okay, next slide, please. this is a lot more kind of detail about how the formulas work. I'm not going to go into that because I know you're more interested in some other areas that we're going to talk about. So let's go to the next slide, but you have it for those who really want to have this information. Next slide, please. Okay, so we at Americans for the Arts put together a list of cities and counties that self-reported to us the amount of CARES Act funds that they got from their local government to distribute to the arts, which was great because they made a solid case to their mayors, their city managers, their county supervisors that arts are a business too. Artists are entrepreneurs as well, and they all need support. So we've provided the URL so that you could read about how programmatically they distributed these funds and what the range was. I mean, a large city like Boston only was able to give out $1 million, but a city like Austin, Texas, $7 million. Douglas County, Nebraska, $10 million given out for arts-related businesses. So the range is very big, and it's much longer list. It's just a snapshot. Let's go to the next slide. So now we want to look at how much we think the American Rescue Plan is going to give out to every state. So the National Association of Counties creates a table based on the formulas that were set out in the American Rescue Plan. And remember, there was an indice for the number of unemployed people. So that NACO did all of the work to figure out what each state and county should expect. These funds will eventually be distributed by the U.S. Treasury Department, which again is something different than CDBG, which is given out by HUD. This is given out by the Treasury Department. And this is what each state can anticipate at minimum probably, and they're calling it an estimate. They've also figured it out for each county. And it's all in alphabetical order, and it's a really cool table to look at. And if you click where it says link to state and county tables, that URL is there for you to go and look at what you think your county and state might get and start getting your mind thinking about what you might want to do. Next slide, please. This is a survey based on how state and county officials spent their money for the CARES Act when they got a block grant of $150 billion. And now the dots in blue represent how they think they're going to spend it now in the future moving forward in 2021. And I think it's really important to see that. So for instance, small business support, which is where a great majority of the arts councils at the local and state level got their funds for that and for nonprofit support. They got it through the CARES Act. It looks like there's going to be a jump, and many elected officials are thinking about increasing how much they're going to give for small business and nonprofit support. Another invitation, if you will, for your groups to get involved with decision-making advocacy with your local and state officials on how they plan on spending the money. As much as I'm going to later on talk about PPP, shuttered venues, and all that kind of stuff, that's nothing compared to the amount of money that you can get from these programs. So don't underestimate it. Even though there's a few hoops you need to go through, it's worth it. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're done with block grants to your state and local governments. Federal governments also created federal relief programs for education. Now, the first one is the one that we're all hearing about, and that is a huge infusion of money for K through 12 schools in these first 100 days since March 11th to get schools to reopen. And many have started reopening all around us. I know here in Virginia they have as a result of this. So that's what the great bulk of the money is for. But I want to bring your attention to 3 other areas where it would be a real opportunity for the arts. Because schools have been closed for so long or abbreviated schedules, the federal government wanted to invest in some summer evidence-based summer enrichment programs. The arts education absolutely falls into this category. The next one is with after-school programs during the school year, $1.25 billion here as well. And then for education technology, which I think we all are very much supportive, and we all need to make sure all the schools have broadband and access like that. This money flows through your state and then local education agencies, and then eventually will be decided school by school. The key here is to work with your local education agencies to start a conversation on how they plan on spending their portion of the funds that they're going to get for after-school programs and for evidence-based summer programs, and to make sure arts education programs are included. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one that's very popular, but it doesn't have as much money, but in comparison to what its annual budget is, these are significant amounts of money. The federal cultural agencies got another infusion of funds. They got it in the original CARES Act. So for instance, NEA and NEH got 75 million each. So they're almost doubling. Again, this is on top of their annual appropriations. Their annual appropriations is about 167.5 million each for NEA and NEH. So you could see this is, for them, a big deal to get 135 million. It's almost their annual appropriation amount. So in terms of what we're hearing of how they plan on distributing the funds, most IMLS stands for Institute Museum Library Services. I will say that the great bulk of that money is going to be going to libraries according to the legislation of what Congress wanted. There is going to be some for museums though, but the great bulk of it is for libraries. And CPB is for Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and that goes to a lot of the affiliates around the country. So let's go to the NEA and NEH. Specifically, I know for the NEA that, like traditional means, the first 40% is going to go to state arts agencies across the country formulaically for them to re-grant for economic relief because of COVID-19 to arts organizations and artists within their state. The NEA has said that they plan on getting that money distributed to the states in the first part of April. So this is a great time to have lots of conversations with your state arts agencies on what their plans are for how they plan on distributing it. This is more money than they got last time, so they might have different opportunities to address. So it's important to do that. The NEA will be giving out their direct grants later on in the last half of April. They plan on releasing the application process, and probably in late April, May, they'll be working on getting it distributed. They did it very quickly last time. I'm sure they'll do it different. They're going to still do it quickly, but there's going to be more of a deliberative process to fix some of the gaps that happened as a result of the first time around. An example being a requirement that an applicant had to be a previous grantee of the NEA in the previous 3 years. I think they're taking a hard look at that to see who got left out. Okay, next slide. Okay, the Emergency Injury Disaster Loan, EIDL. This is a program of the Small Business Administration. And what's important here that we all kind of know about since we learned about it in 2020 is that we were successful in getting not only nonprofits, but individual gig workers and entrepreneurs to be recognized as businesses by the Small Business Administration. Those individual workers were never recognized as being eligible for an SBA program ever before. So that's a big deal. It continues with the American Rescue Plan to be able to provide those kind of benefits to these kinds of businesses. Now, what's important to know about the Emergency Injury Disaster Loan is a few things. One is that this is not a forgivable loan. This actually is debt that you are taking on. When the program, but it's with very favorable terms. For instance, there's no application fee, there's no prepayment penalty. It is a loan like a mortgage. It's over 30 years, so your repayment amounts can probably be very, very small. When it was first released, it was very popular. There wasn't a lot of money, so they limited the maximum loan that you could get to $150,000. Doesn't mean you got 150 because it's based on your actual expenditures and what your credit score is. And if you want to take out that amount, because anything above $25,000, you needed to provide collateral. Anything under $25,000, no collateral required whatsoever. So I found that a lot of nonprofit groups stuck at 25,000 or less. But you had up to 150. And what's in the last week, what has changed is that the Biden administration wants to recognize the fact that the pandemic has lasted longer than anyone anticipated. And so they are automatically providing an opportunity for every applicant who had a borrower who has an EIDL loan to increase the amount proportionately up to a maximum of $500,000 if you qualify, to be able to borrow more money if you need it. Again, it's based on your expenses and your credit score and need. So they are going to contact them, the applicants directly. They do it by email only, and it's from an SBA.gov website and URL email address. Be careful of the SBA.com, stay away from that. It has to be SBA.gov. In terms of what the interest rate is for the individual entrepreneur, gig worker, or for a commercial business, it's 3.75%, but for nonprofits, it's 2.75%. So that's very favorable. Another thing that the Biden administration just did in the last week is that repayment was set up to be 12 months after you first received your loan. Now they automatically extended it another 12 months, so it's 24 months later. So if you got a loan in May of 2020, you do not have to begin repaying it until May of 2022. That's really terrific as well. That automatically happened. You did not have to request it. Now, of course, if you have the means and you want to start repaying it, you can, but you don't have to. Next slide, please. So we've heard a lot about advances, EIDL advances. That was very popular in 2020 because when you went to apply for the loan, whether you accepted the loan or not, you automatically got an advance. And that advance was originally promised to be $10,000, but there wasn't enough money to do that. So what the SBA did to manage this situation is they let you have $1,000 per employee that you said that you had. And if you were an entrepreneur, you would count yourself as an employee of one, and you would get $1,000 per employee to the applicant. And that would be money that you would not have to repay. Originally, that EIDL advance was something that, though, was counted as an advance against repaying your PPP loan, but that's also been taken out. So this is free and clear money. The problem is that there is no longer any more what's called COVID EIDL advances. You can't apply for it anymore. That program is now done. However, with the American Rescue Plan, they've created something called the targeted EIDL advances. And again, it's meant for those that are most in need, and they define that as living and working in a low poverty area. I've given the URL right there in the middle of those bullets. Check to see if your business is in the targeted area. And you could put in the street address of the address you use to apply for the SBA loan. So keep in mind, did you use your work address, your personal address, things like that? Because that is what will determine whether you can be eligible. And what is it that you're eligible for? Congress and the White House have put in considerable billions of dollars more money into this targeted advance so that those who are living in these low poverty areas can get the original full $10,000 that was originally promised as an EIDL advance in the CARES Act of 2020. And in 2021, they want to complete that pledge so that if you were a company and you had 2 employees, you only got $2,000. What the SBA is going to do is they are checking all of the addresses through this mapping system. And if your application falls into that category, they are automatically going to email you, again with the SBA.gov email address, so you know it's real. And they're going to say, hey, look, we'd like to complete and give you the full 10,000. The only thing you need to do is to show that you had a 25% loss in any 8-week period from 2019 to 2020. I think it's pretty easy to do that. And you have to just put in the form to say, yes, I would like this money. And then what will happen is that company will get $8,000 free and clear, not reportable income on your taxes, and you do not have to repay it. So it's a good deal. And it's not something that you can apply for. It can only happen if you were an EIDL applicant in 2020 or right up until today to get a loan, whether you accept it or not. You still have that right to that advance. It's for those folks. I don't think that you can apply for it directly. And I know if you fell into that category where you got an advance in 2020, you cannot request the targeted balance of that. The SBA will only contact you, and that's the only way it'll work. Next slide, please. Paycheck Protection Program. So while this is an SBA program, it is not a program that you apply to the SBA for. You have to go through a bank or a lender. And I use that word lender because that encompasses things like credit unions, online lenders like PayPal, Cabbage, Square, Womply, the list goes on, that are not your traditional FDIC banks. That is who you would need to go through because the SBA interfaces with them, not directly with the borrower. And that's important to know. So if a lot of folks get confused about whether they have an EIDL or Paycheck Protection loan. And the best way to find out is, who did you get the loan from? That's what you ask. If you got it directly from the SBA, then it's an EIDL loan. And if you got it from a bank, then it's a PPP. So that's one little trick for you. So now let's talk about the Paycheck Protection Program, probably the most popular program of all programs of the federal government during this pandemic period. And what it does is it's set up as a loan, but it's called a forgivable loan because you have to do some paperwork, you have to use the money correctly as promised. And if you do those things, they forgive the loan and you don't have to repay it. You don't have to count the money as taxable income. And the expenses that you use to pay with the PPP. So with a PPP, here are a few rules to make sure it's forgiven. One is that you have to use at least 60% for payroll. And payroll is quite widely defined as not just your wages, but also the taxes that you pay and contributions to retirement plans and health insurance and vision and dental insurance and things like that, all included in payroll. You have to use at least 60% of that for payroll. And if you are an entrepreneur, that means paying yourself. Now you can also use 100% too. I'm just saying minimally you have to use 60%. And on a maximum level, you have to use a maximum of 40% on overhead costs like rent and building like computers and things like that. Now, what I was talking about earlier about taxability is that, so the money that you made on that PPP, you do not even put into your tax return. It is not counted as taxable income, neither as business income or as ordinary personal income. But you get a second double dipping possibility. The expenses that you paid for the rent of your building, let's say, for your business, you use PPP funds to pay for that. So the theory would have normally been, okay, you can't deduct those expenses because it was paid for with a grant that you didn't even have to use as income. But what the federal government made clear is that not only do you not count the income, you get to count the expenses on your tax return. So you get to add that on your tax return, so you have fewer taxes to pay because you've increased your expenses. That is what I call a very good deal. A lot of people were incredulous about this, that it was clearly double dipping, and the federal government said, we don't care if it's double dipping, we want to help taxpayers and businesses, and especially small businesses. Now let's talk about a few other things. The PPP was originally, the application deadline was originally going to be March 31st, today. And yesterday, President Biden signed into law an additional piece of legislation that went swimming in a bipartisan way through Congress last week to extend the application for PPP to May 31st. And so Biden enacted it into law yesterday. And so now the new official deadline for applying for a PPP is May 31st. Now, you might want to say, oh, great, I got plenty of time. But at the same time, the money is dwindling down. As of this week, there's about $75 billion left. So that's about a quarter of what they had to work with. So it's going quickly. I think that if you do your application now, you're going to be fine. This extension was desperately needed because banks did not have enough time to get it processed, because SBA was telling them that they had to have it done earlier because SBA had to finalize it by the 31st as well of March. So what this new law that just got enacted is banks have a deadline to get into SBA by May 31st, but SBA doesn't have to finish processing it until June 30th. So they got a little breathing room too, which will give breathing room to you, the borrowers, because a lot of artificial deadlines were created by banks this year. Places like Chase, Citibank, they wanted your they would only accept applications, say, through March 11th, March 13th, March 15th at the latest. And it caused a lot of pain for a lot of organizations and individuals because, one, it might be interfering with their unemployment and collecting unemployment as opposed to PPP. Two, it was interfering with whether they apply for a shuttered venue grant, because also earlier, the shuttered venue grant was created with the December 27th legislation called the Economic Aid Act. And at that time, they said that you couldn't apply for a PPP and a shuttered venue. And the shuttered venue was taking a long time to get going, and it's still not open. And so people were torn as to whether they do a PPP or a shuttered venue. The American Rescue Plan passed legislation so that you could get a PPP as long as you apply for it before you get a shuttered venue. And that portion of your PPP will be deducted from your shuttered venue. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but it involves PPP, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit. So that was an issue. And then another issue on top of that was causing a lot of consternation in March. It was a great opportunity, but it was also a challenge for banks to follow through quickly. And that is, the Biden administration did something phenomenal that a lot of groups, including Americans for the Arts, had been heavily lobbying for on behalf of gig workers. And that is, it was really unfair to use a calculation for your PPP amount based on a gig worker's Schedule C net profits, because usually the net profits are very low, if not even in the negative. And so you can't multiply, divide by 12 and multiply by 2.5 out of something that's so small. So they didn't really benefit from the PPP program. And so they stayed on unemployment. This now is a little bit of a game changer, because now in early March, the Biden administration made an executive decision to say, gig workers, you can now apply for a PPP based on your gross income instead of your net profits. Well, that is a game changer. That's a total game changer. The problem is banks. It took a long time for SBA to update the form, because if you didn't use the right form, you couldn't get it. And banks were waiting for SBA to do the right form. At the same time, the deadline was passing of when you could apply. So it caused a lot of problems in March. Hopefully, things are going to get worked out now that the extension has gone to May 31st. I'm going to talk now for a moment, not yet in the next slide, but on what it means for gig workers. But just to keep covering PPP for a moment, you have a choice on how long your covered period is going to be for. It can be as little as 8 weeks, and it can be as much as 24 weeks. For many organizations, it doesn't matter if it's 8 or 24, just take the 24, it's up to you. But for a gig worker, I think it's to your benefit to make it as short as possible, meaning 8 weeks. And the reason why is because you cannot be on unemployment and taking pay from your PPP at the same time. If you can make your PPP covered period 8 weeks, you can go back on unemployment if you are still out of work, so that you have maximum benefits for it. And if you had never taken a PPP before because of the whole net profit calculation, now's the time to really relook at that. And one of the main reasons why, I know this is one of the questions that came in advance about what's, if the PPP is about the same amount as the unemployment, why go through it? There's, you're right. I mean, if you're getting about the same amount for unemployment, you can just stay on that. But here's the value of the PPP. And that is that you can pick up extra gig work. If opportunities are starting to arise now where you can pick up jobs here and there, those same jobs will disqualify you from unemployment funds, whereas it will not disqualify you. You can work as much as you want and getting paid for work while you're on a PPP, while it will disqualify you if you're on unemployment. So keep that in mind. For those of you who want a real deep dive into PPP, both the applications and more importantly, maybe the forgiveness forms, I've put in a URL both up on top on the title section and at the bottom here from a law firm called Proskauer that Americans for the Arts has a legal relationship with. And they have developed a phenomenal guide, really phenomenal, on the PPP process and forgiveness. And we have posted it on our website and giving it to you here too. Let's go to the next slide. So the forms, this is so important. If you don't use the right forms, you don't get the benefits. So I've created this page primarily for all of you out there who are gig workers and entrepreneurs who really weren't able to take advantage of the PPP program in 2020 and want to do it now. You have to really use those right forms. So the new form to make a first draw PPP application is 2483-C. That C is your clue that it's because you are a Schedule C self-employed person or entrepreneur, or however you want to call yourself. The key is you have to have filed a Schedule C. It doesn't work if you're a Subchapter S or you're an LLC and you didn't file a Schedule C. Even though you have that chance, you have to have filed a Schedule C. That's the only way that you can get to the Emerald Island. So if you use the wrong form, you will not have the ability to use your gross income. So it's really important that you work with a bank that has the right form. And I'm giving you the right form right there, 2483-C. If you had a PPP last year and you're now looking for your second draw with a higher amount, you want to get 2483-SD, standing for second draw, and then the -C. That is really important because that is the only time that you'll get that question for a gross income. But just remember, this applies to anyone looking for a second draw this year. And that is, you have to show a 25% loss during any one quarter from 2019 to 2020. That is really important, that you need to show that piece. For those of you who could get a PPP loan of $150,000 or less, which is going to be a lot of gig workers, you don't have to show it up front, but you have to have still incurred that loss. And if asked, you need to be able to provide proof, but you won't be asked in the first round. So now there is going to be a scenario where there are some of you who already filed with the wrong, I'm not going to say the wrong form, but the form wasn't available to you in February, late January. And you filed for either a second or first draw, even though you were Schedule C, you filed it on the other form and it was based on net profits. What do? If you haven't been funded yet by the bank, ask them to cancel it and then reapply using the correct form. That is advice directly from the SBA. If you've already been funded with the PPP money, you got to hang on tight, because we're putting a lot of lobbying pressure on Congress and the SBA that it's unfair for those who were diligent about filing their PPP loan, because, you know, it's a race, first come, first serve. And you qualified based on a lower amount based on net profit. Usually it is a lower amount if it's based on net profit. We're asking people to send messages to Congress, to the SBA, to say, correct this problem. At the moment, the SBA is saying they can't correct it. But the political people, the Biden administration political people at the SBA and at the White House are saying, we are very aware of this problem, and we hope that there's going to be enough money left over that we can correct this problem. So that's where we're left right now. There isn't a solution for you, but hopefully help is on the way. Okay, and I gave the forms for those who are not Schedule C. Let's go to the next slide, because I want to point out what that form looks like. So this is a Schedule C form. It says right on top, for Schedule C filers, it is a second draw application. The second thing I've circled is here. It asks for your total gross income. None of the other original PPP applications ever had that. It always said net profits for the entrepreneurs. So that's what's different. That's what you need to look for. Next slide, please. Okay, forgiveness. It's important to know that the SBA and Congress says you do not need to complete your forgiveness application for your first draw in order to get your second draw. But banks can ask for that if they want to. So there are some banks that don't care. PayPal, Womply, a lot of the online lenders, they don't care that you did or didn't complete your forgiveness yet. So great. But there are other banks that do care. Another type of bank that would care is if you don't use the same lender for your second draw that you did your first draw. Typically, those lenders want you to complete forgiveness with the other lender before you do business with them. So now now that there's an extension of May 31st, you have a little bit more time to do that if you are being required to do it. I just want to make sure you also don't rest too easily on that May 31st date. Still try to get it done as fast as possible, because they can only give out money as long as the money lasts. If it all gets spent because of all the applications coming in, they can't give you invisible money. So there is still a little bit of a race. Now, in terms of applications, I just want to point out that there are 3 forgiveness forms. One is 3508S. S stands for shortest form. And then there's one that's 3508EZ, and there's nothing easy about it, even though it's called easy. And then there is 3508 without a letter after it, and that is the long form. And that's for groups that got 2 million or more. They have a lot of explaining that they have to do for it. If they didn't do everything correctly, use it all, 60% for payroll. If there are exceptions and things like that, that they have to give back, usually that's for the long form. The S form was created for small businesses and self-employed people to use. It's very easy. Don't even be intimidated by it. It's super easy. It's a lot of certifications. And so that's what I would recommend to a lot of the nonprofits, is to use the S form. If you have conditions that you didn't completely meet, I'm going to ask you to either look at the FAQs or go back to that Proskauer deep dive on forgiveness to go through all the possibilities of what you might need to do. Also on our website, that original website on page 1 of this URL, of this slide deck I gave you, we did a dedicated webinar on forgiveness and went through all the 3 forms and how you use it. So you can also refer to that as a webinar as well. Next slide, please. And before I go to shuttered venues, I want to say one cool thing about the extension of the PPP to May 31st. For those of you who are taking their first draw in 2021, because you didn't participate in 2020, there's now enough time for you to get a second draw as long as money is still available. So I think a lot of this might apply to a lot of you who are entrepreneurs and gig workers. You didn't participate in 2020, it wasn't worth it. And now it is because of the gross income calculation. Apply now as fast as possible so that 8 weeks can go by and you can apply for a second draw if there's still money available. That is a nice little bonus as a result of this extension. Okay, now let's talk about shuttered venues. So the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant, also known as SVOG, is a program also of the Small Business Administration, and you apply directly to the Small Business Administration. It was established in the December legislation called the Economic Aid Act, but it was also amended in some positive ways with both money and policies in the American Rescue Act on March 12th. It's, as I mentioned, it's administered by the SBA, and it's intended to provide substantial, and I really mean substantial, support for shuttered venues as a result of COVID-19 shutdowns. And it's about a $16 billion program. I think it's the largest program for the arts and culture ever created by the federal government for one single program in one single shot. It is for those that do live performing arts, and you don't have to be the venue. You could be the dance company who doesn't have their own venue, but you perform at live venues. So it's both the venue and the performing arts organization itself, both for-profit and nonprofit. And it got expanded. A lot of you knew it as SOS, Save Our Stages. That got expanded to now include museums, aquariums, and zoos that have a live performing or kind of lecture hall, any kind of live seated area within their venue. It's not because they're a museum that they're getting this money. It's because they have a audience site within theater within their museum. Same thing with zoos and aquariums. And it also got extended to movie theaters and talent representatives. So all of these are organizations except for talent representatives. And this is where some individuals who are talent representatives and agents can apply, which is great as well. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just for you to have handy all the URLs that are key for you to prepare yourself for a shuttered venue application, which will open on April 8th of next month. So it is definitely based on a first come, first serve, and the hardest hit are the two biggest criteria. So it's going to be really important as we go through these next slides of you understanding what you need to do to prepare. And you really need to prepare now so that on April 8th, all you're doing is completing some simple forms and uploading a ton of content that you've gotten ready to upload to justify your application. It is going to be a lot of work, but it's a lot of money too. And I'm going to go through that in a moment. So these are some key things. Just like Proskauer Law Firm did a deep dive into PPP, they did a phenomenal one for Shuttered Venue Operator Guide, so that you can see it there in red, deep dive. I really recommend it. It's really sensational. The webinar that the SBA did yesterday was their first real webinar on the Shuttered Venue program, going through a lot of information. I participated in it, so I know a lot of the key things that changed based on things they've previously written. So I'll go through that as well. That webinar was recorded. It will eventually go on their YouTube site, but it's not there yet. Otherwise, I would have that here too. But I've given the very first URL as the Shuttered Venue, and they'll eventually post it there. But right now, it's not available online. At least I haven't found it. Maybe someone has found the secret place that it is. And they can put it in the Q&A if they have. Okay, so there are some great tutorial videos that the SBA has created for all of the various eligible groups that can apply. There's a particularly good one on getting a DUNS and a SAM.gov registration as well. All that is available for you here, and it's also posted on our website. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've alluded to the fact that it's going to be a lot of work, but I've also alluded to the fact that it's going to be worth it because it's a lot of money. How much money? So based on your eligibility, if all that works out, it's 45% of your gross earned revenue in 2019. That's about half of your earned revenue for the entire year in 2019, when you would have been your last good year prior to the pandemic. The maximum is 10 million though. So it's the lesser of that 45% or 10 million if it's that big. So that's an enormous amount of money. What you should know about it is that it is also not taxable. So this really is helpful for those of you who are for-profit or talent representatives who are actually paying taxes as opposed to a nonprofit. You do not have to report this on your taxable income. It's right there in black and white on the FAQs. So that's a double benefit, that you're going to get this huge amount of money, and it's not going to be taxable income for you. And the expenses that you paid out in 2016, you could still deduct as expenses. So that's your triple benefit. This is an enormous amount of money, but it is going to be a lot of work. So you got to just go into it knowing it's a lot of work, but it's going to pay off. So let's break it down. You have to have been in operation on January 1, 2019. Of course, anything earlier is great, but it starts to become problematic afterwards. For entities that began operations after January 1, 2019, the amount that you can receive is based on you divide the number of months that you were in operation, and then you multiply that by 6. So you get 6 months worth of your average monthly gross revenue. So it's different. It can also be very confusing because some things they apply gross revenue, some things earned revenue, and I'm going to go through that in a few minutes as well. There also is a chance of getting supplemental grants. I think the chances of there being money left over for supplemental grants, at least in this round, is probably very small. This is going to become a very, very popular program. Thousands and thousands of people were on that webinar as potential applicants yesterday. So I don't think people should be thinking that, oh, there's going to be an opportunity to get supplemental grants. What a supplemental grant is the equivalent of a second draw. Of the first draw is getting compensated for all the money that you lost in 2020 based on 2019 revenue. The supplemental is based on the losses that you're incurring in 2021. And it would be 50% of the amount that you got in your first draw, SO shuttered venue. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of that one, only because I don't think there's going to be a lot of money. However, I'm going to put an asterisk on it to say that it would still be, if you are lucky enough to get one of these shuttered venue first grants, it's still worth it to apply for the supplemental, even though there's a risk of no money being there, because two things. One is SBA has said that they might give a voucher for what they would have given you if there had been money. And second, Congress loves to replenish a popular program. So if this turns out to be as popular as I think it's going to be, it's very likely Congress is going to replenish it, and those that got the tokens for a supplemental grant will be the first in line to get more money. So for that reason, it's worth doing. Okay, so with the additional money that the American Rescue Plan put in, there's about $16 billion to work with in grants. The SBA thinks that they're going to get about 15,000 applications, and the money's going to go out pretty quickly. So you're going to see this bit of advice I give consistently in some upcoming slides as well, and that is, if you have any doubt of whether you're eligible for this program or not, I still want you to apply, because I don't want you to disqualify yourself. Let the SBA disqualify you if that's it, but there's also a good chance you might qualify. From what I've had lots of conversations with the SBA folks, and they are really looking for ways to say yes, not say no. So with that as the guiding principle, I would say apply whenever in doubt. Next slide, please. The other thing that is good that you should know is that as a result of now allowing groups to apply for a PPP before they get an SVOG, and then it'll reduce the amount of SVOG, I think it is going to extend the amount of applicants they can fund with a shuttered venue, because now the first portion of your money is being funded out of a different program that has a lot more money in it, which is the PPP program. So for that reason, I think they're going to be able to fund more than 15,000 organizations and talent representatives. So how do the priority grants come? I've already mentioned it's first come, first serve, but it's going to be based on priority rounds. And the SBA is very clear that they are the ones who decide if you fit in priority 1, 2, or 3, or the set aside. You do not decide. So all you have to do is put your best foot forward and explaining the amount of losses that you have with some good Excel documents, maybe showing it month by month, that can then show it within quarters, because there are times when the SBA is looking for quarterly information and times when it's looking for month-to-month information. You want to do it for both 2019 and 2020. So what they're looking at is in the first 14 days of applications that come in. And I think it's probably going to break their brand new system, their portal that they're creating, but I think they're going to be getting a lot of applications on April 8th when they open up. And it's going to be date and time stamped. And that's important because that is the order that they are going to go in reviewing each application and sorting them out as to whether they go into a priority 1, priority 2, priority 3, the set aside, anything left over. So that date and time is very important. Now, You do not want to risk submitting an incomplete application so that you can get a earlier date and time stamp, because they will reject the application if it's incomplete. It has to be fully complete, put in all your evidence, even if it means you don't submit until April 9th. It's more important that you have a complete application, because if it's rejected, they will not honor the original date and time stamp. They made that clear to us. So priority one, they're the applicants that will be funded first. And they are looking for those applicants that can show a 90% loss or more of gross revenue. And my next slide is going to have the definitions of gross revenue and the other revenues. And it's for a particular period. It's not for an entire fiscal year or calendar year. It's just for the months of April through December of 2020. That's why I encourage everyone to do your financial information on a monthly basis. And then they want to see that for the exact same months, April through December of 2019, so they can compare 2019 numbers to 2020 numbers, looking at gross revenue, which is essentially all of your revenue. If you're a nonprofit, yes, that means you have to put in your donated money, even your capital campaigns and things like that. Unfortunately, it's everything when it comes to gross revenue. So you look at all your gross revenue in 2019, and then you look at it for 2020 to see the difference. And I can see the hour, it's 5:05, so I'm confident I'm going to be going longer. It's probably going to go to 5:30. So for purposes of preserving the recording, I'm going to do the whole thing. And I hope that many of you could stay on as long as you can. Otherwise, you can come back and see the part that you missed because you had to sign off at 5. Okay, so going back to priorities. For priority 2, they're looking at the same time period, but here it's a 70% loss of gross revenue. And then for priority 3, this is something that I know that many groups and us lobbied very hard for, is making sure that they're interpreting of the law as it was written. Originally, priority 3 was also going to be based on gross revenue, a 25% loss of gross revenue. But we finally made the case that the way the legislation was written and its intent was based on it being on earned revenue. So in this case, you do not have to show donated funds, capital campaigns, things like that. It's or even interest on endowment money. Earned revenue is just those things that you're actively selling, tuition, things like that. Prior 3 is based on earned revenue. So that's important because, you know, the way you show your income, you want to make sure you make it clear of what portion of your revenue is earned revenue and what portion falls outside of earned revenue, so that they can do the calculation correctly and put you in the right category. You might be a nonprofit that fits in the gross revenue top priority as well, but a lot of nonprofits, because you are going to have to include your donated revenue, are probably going to fall into priority 3. But then there's this other catch-all, which is the set aside for small businesses, which nonprofits are, with 50 or fewer employees, and they will start funding those immediately starting on day 1 as well. But based on the FAQs and based on their webinar yesterday, unfortunately, they are interpreting that set aside use as just another pot of money to fund priority 1 and 2. So that it's not really a set aside for businesses that don't fall into the 90 and 70% category. It's really for those that do both. You've had either a 90 or 70% loss, and you're a small business of 50 or fewer employees. They're going to pull the grant money from that set aside first, starting on day 1. And then if you don't fall into that small business, they'll pull it from the priority funds. They have 80% maximum of the 16 billion to use on this normal grant making priority 1, 2, 3, and then they have a minimum of 2 billion or more to use on the small businesses. But the way they're running it for probably so it's more streamlined for them, less work. They're running it as just simply another pot of money to pull from to pay for the first round of priorities in 1, 2, and if there's anything left over for 3. So a lot of groups are worried that all the money will be taken up in priority 1 and 2, and we don't know. It could, but I still want you to apply, and it's for that reason I told you earlier, and that is Congress loves to replenish a popular program. So you want to be first in line if it gets replenished to get funded, because you'll have that date and time stamp of having applied with a complete application. So it's to your benefit to do it, even if you don't get it in this first round and you get it in a future round. So please do it. And then let's see if there's a question about why do we have to capture all the employment information? And it's primarily to either fit in the 50 or fewer set aside money, or there is only one time where there's a maximum of 500 employees that you can have, and it's really for a multinational corporation that is doing business in more than one state, or more than 10 states, or more than one country. So that's the only time it really applies. There is no cap on the number of employees that you can have. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I mentioned these are the definitions. I literally took photos of every slide that was at the SBA webinar, because I knew that they would take a long time in getting things posted, and I had this webinar for you today. So I took photos, and this is literally their language that they put up yesterday, that for first and second priorities, they're using the definition of gross revenue. And so gross revenue is defined as all revenue in whatever form from whatever source, including contributions, donations, and grants, except for disaster assistance. So this is an important exception. So if your nonprofit organization got a PPP loan, you do not have to include that as revenue in 2020, which will help make your loss look bigger, maybe get closer to that 70 or 90%, or maybe 25% if you fall in that category. That's important. If you got an EIDL loan, you do not include that loan inside your assistance. If you got a CARES Act grant that went from federal government to state government to maybe even the local government that you got from your local arts agency as an economic relief grant, you don't have to include that either as revenue that you received in 2020. So by not having to include that, that will make your revenue total amount in 2020 much smaller and perhaps show a much larger loss. That's important. Then in terms of the third priority, where you only have to use earned revenue, their definition of earned revenue is the first one there, and it says it's monies received from the sale of goods or services. It does not include other funds such as donations, sponsorships, government assistance, or returns on investment, like interest on your endowment, things like that, or money in your set aside that you might have. So you don't have to include that. I'm sorry, you don't have to include that in the definition of earned revenue for qualifying for priority 3. There are times where gross earned revenue is used, and that is in qualifying just to get in the door to be considered a shuttered venue. You have to show at least a 25% gross earned revenue loss. So here's yet another definition. And this one for gross earned revenue is the total of earned revenue from various sales of beverages, advertising sales, and contracted presentation income. So it's earned income above plus these other items, most of which I think companies already include in earned income, but this is how they have defined it. It seems very similar. I don't find a big difference between gross earned revenue and earned revenue, but gross earned revenue is the term that's used in determining whether you qualify even as a shuttered venue, which is a 25% loss in gross earned revenue. Next slide, please. Eligible entities. There are a total of 6. One is the live venue operator or promoter. Second is the theater producer. Third is the live performing arts organization operator. We had a nice hand in providing SBA a definition for that. One of the things I'm most pleased about is that we got festivals and schools in there as one of the qualifying venues that a performing arts organization can be performing at to qualify. I think that was very helpful for a lot of nonprofits. Relevant museum operator. Museums are, they're using the definition of museum that comes from IMLS legislation. Movie picture theater operator and talent representative. And one of the things that the talent representatives have to make sure that they qualify for is that no less than 70% of their business operations involves representation and management of 2 or more artists or entertainers. That is a really important cutoff point. I think it's pretty easy for most talent representatives to qualify that way, but it is something to keep in mind. And it is something that you need to be sure to provide evidence that you qualify that way as well. With all of these things, you always want to make sure that you go on overkill in terms of providing evidentiary information. Don't err on the side of under information, go for over information, because you don't want to be in a situation where they reject your application and therefore forego your date and time stamp because you didn't give enough information. And let's go to the next slide. I'm not going to read all those definitions. You have those available to you here. Is that a lot of people got concerned about the whole fixed seating thing. That does not apply to live performing arts venues. It only applies to museums and movie theaters and aquariums and zoos. Okay, so eligible entities, you need to have been in operation on or before February 29th, 2020. Operation means you actually made money because you're doing, you're multiplying 45% of revenue to determine how much your grant is. They've defined being operational as actually having made money, so you have something to multiply it by. That's an important piece to note because you can be operational and just spending lots of money while you get ready to open up. But if you didn't make any money, you're not going to qualify. So that's important. I've already talked about the gross revenue to qualify as an entity. And then the new change that you can now go for a PPP, which really relieved a lot of organizations in case they didn't think they were going to get any money for a shuttered venue and they were going to lose their opportunity for a PPP. Now you can have both. You don't have to worry about the risk. That's why it's important to get your PPP, I think, and then go for your shuttered venue. Some people have asked in questions in advance, why do it if they're just going to reduce the PPP amount from the shuttered venue? I have the hassle of applying for forgiveness and going through a whole bunch of other rules for that. Why not just take the full amount from the shuttered venue? And my answer to you is you have that choice to do it. But you also have to know that you are taking a risk on something that's possible, shuttered venue, a brand new grant program, Lots of ins and outs that you may or may not qualify for. Will the money run out? What priority period are you in? All of those things. So there's more risk in getting the grant. The PPP, usually it's going to be your second draw. It's a done deal. It's easy to get, fast to get, and a well-known entity of knowing how to get it. So that is the difference it's the risk factor. So that's my best advice on why I think you should go for a PPP first. Then for a few key things about what will make you ineligible to get money. And most of it is not going to apply to you, but here we go. That you're listed on the National Security Exchange stock market. You receive more than 10% of your gross revenue from the federal government. There is an exception for state and local government entities that are going to be applying, and an exception for colleges and universities that are going to be applying because it's impossible. They all get more than 10% in federal money, so they have an exception. That there's some kind of sexual nature to the performances that you're booking or that you are presenting at your live venue or that you're producing as an arts organization. And that means it has to be pornographic, not just sexual. It has to be pornographic. And I already talked about this, is if you're in more than one country. Now, a question that we've gotten in advance and I get repeatedly is, what if I am booking people who are coming from another country to perform in America? That's okay. What the talent, and this is primarily for talent reps that are asking this question. If your business is in America, you're paying taxes in America, and you're booking the majority of these events on American soil, then you qualify. It doesn't matter that the groups that you're representing are coming from another country. Next slide, please. Let's see. Okay, so this is just more eligibility information, and it really is the uniqueness of what each entity needs to know in order to qualify. Now, my advice is, and you all can read this yourselves, and you've probably read it many times on the Shuttered Venue website yourself. My advice, though, to you is that if they're saying that this is something that you need to show in order to qualify, my advice is that you present the evidence to show that you meet that criteria. So if we jump down and it says you need to show that you advertise events through print or online media, you need to take screenshots of websites. You need to PDF the print media and advertising that's been done. And don't just do it for a few or one or two, do it for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 examples. So it's clear that you are meeting this criteria and that you're doing it for the time period that they're looking for, which is 2019 and 2020. Don't show things from 2018. Don't show things or even earlier. It doesn't matter. It will not help justify the criteria that they're asking you to meet. If they're saying that you need to have at least one of these people do 2 of these positions, make it clear. Show job descriptions, show that the person is an employee on your payroll and that they do these for multiple events throughout the year, things like that. You need to be overkill on information so they don't go looking to say, oh, wait a minute, how did they justify this criteria? You don't want to be in that position. You want to be in the position of saying, everything you need is right in front of you to make your decision today, in the first 14 days of priority, even. That's what you want. That's your goal. And no one is going to reject you for giving too much information. but you can be rejected for giving too little information. Let's go to the next slide. In the interest of time, I'm going to go a little bit faster. Each eligible entity, and I mentioned there were 6, have their own unique criteria that they have to meet. And that fixed seating is the big one for places like museums and motion picture theaters. So, and the marketing and audience seating, you want to take lots of great pictures that make, and don't just take a picture of the audience seating. That's good, but you need to place it. You need to make sure it's clear that that is your theater, not anybody's theater that you just took a picture of, that it's your theater. Somehow that it shows that it's under your authority, that this venue is in your space. Because they have to be careful of fraudulent claims. They're very conscious of this. It is public federal dollars. And we've seen other programs go through this kind of fraudulent claims like PPP and stuff. So they're very conscious of it. So remove any suspicion from their mind and make sure that what you're showing them is your property. And then this next, Joy mentioned it, you want to make sure the DUNS and SAM number is important. That's so important because you can't even get past go on April 8th unless you have a DUNS and SAM number in place, because it's one of the first questions they're going to ask you to do on the form. If it's not filled out, you can't go past go. It does take a couple weeks to get that SAM's account online. It is a cumbersome process. Those of you who have applied for NEA grants, you know it, you already know the system, so you have an advantage. For those who don't, that is a serious disadvantage because it is so cumbersome and hard to deal with. For those of you who are affiliates of a larger organization, you may not have your own nonprofit status, but you can get your own employer ID number, EIN. And SBA has made it clear that affiliates of a larger organization, this usually applies to universities, big museums that might have different divisions, a maximum of 5 can apply for a collective amount of $10 million. If there are more than 5, they're not going to look at it after that if they're part of a larger affiliate. And the affiliate may not have its own nonprofit status, but they can have, as I said, their own EIN number that you get from the IRS. You can call and get it the same day. With the EIN number, you can get a DUNS number. With the DUNS number, you can get the SAM account. So that is really the best advice I can give you, because a lot of people are torn about, you know, how to do it. Just try to get your EIN number. Work with your larger corporate affiliate to help you secure that. I've worked with a lot in my office hours with groups who are an affiliate of a larger group, and they have told me for years they've been getting NEA grants based on not having its own nonprofit status. Their nonprofit status comes from the larger university, and they can use that, but they create their own EIN number for just the grant to them. And that I haven't experienced that myself, but I've been told that by multiple organizations that they've been running it that way. So I offer that as something from other people's experiences. Some people have asked for how do you calculate how many employees you have, and this is for purposes of staying under that under 50, so you get extra points of being an extra small business. If a full-time employee is 30 hours or more per week, you do not include 1099 workers as an employee, obviously, but just to make it super clear, you do not. Contractors can't be included as an employee, but when you get the money for SVOG, you can use it to pay 1099 workers, but you can't use it to determine how many employees you are. In this case, it works to your benefit. You want as few employees as possible to show that you are truly a small business. So here in this case, as I mentioned, a full-time employee is 30 hours per week, and that would be considered 1 FTE, full-time equivalent employee. Anywhere between 10 and 30 hours per week is a half-time employee. 0.5 FTE, and anything under 10, so 9 hours per week somebody works, they are not considered an employee at all. Nothing. That's a 0. So how would that work? Let's say you had 3 FTEs and 3 0.5 FTEs, half-time FTEs. That is the equivalent of 3 plus 1.5. That's 4.5 FTEs. Even though it's 6 people, it's 4.5 FTEs. That's how you calculate it. And you do it for each payroll period. Next slide, please. Oh, there was the audited financials. I know that's an important thing. Can you go back for one moment? The very last line in red. This caused a lot of consternation because the SBA had said that it was going to require audits in order to apply, and they've reversed that. Lots of feedback they got on that. There will not be a requirement of an audit unless you are a major, but I will say that if you are a company that regularly gets audits, you should submit it because that's helpful. It shows you are a good steward of money, but it's not required. And it's only going to be required if you are an entity that receives more than $750,000 in federal funds, whether it was before you get SVOG or as a result of getting SVOG. You're going to have to get an audit to report later. But you won't need an audit beforehand unless you get $750 of federal funds. Now, you do not have to include in federal funds those things I talked about, PPP, EIDL, things like that. You do not have to include that as federal funds. So that's important. And they keep on saying that they want the accrual method in showing your cash loss and determining your revenue. But I know that that's causing a lot of problems for some people, but they don't seem to be changing their mind or the way they want to do it. And they're going to want that accrual method. So some people are going to have to show their financial statements different than the way they actually do them. I know it's going to feel like you're doing 2 sets of books, but this is being presented for purposes of a grant application that's requiring it. Next slide, please. Allowable expenses, they are very clear on, and it's very gracious and broad, the amount of things that you can spend on allowable expenses. You can, if the owner of a club had loaned money to the business during the pandemic to keep alive, you can repay the owner. You can pay for debt, including principal and interest for those things that were either incurred during the pandemic or prior to the pandemic, as long as you can prove that you did it before, I think it's February 29th. I think that's the date. Oh no, I think it's February 15th. I see it here in my notes. And what's important about that is, so for instance, with a PPP, for overhead costs, you can only use the PPP for interest on debt that you're paying. This is different. You can use it on the actual principal repayment and interest. You can't use it to take out new debt. You can't use it to pay back your EIDL loan or something like that. But if you had a mortgage on your property prior to the pandemic, you can use this money to pay your monthly mortgage payments. I found that to be very, very helpful and welcoming. So that's great. One of the questions that had come in earlier was, do we need to provide a specific plan on how we going to use the money? That became crystal clear at yesterday's SBA webinar, that you do need to put together a budget of how you're going to use the money within each of the eligible uses that are outlined on the SBA website. As clear as day, there's a form for eligible uses, and it's also one of the URLs that I provided you. And you need to categorize how much you plan on using in each one of the categories. And they will allow only a 10% deviation. So let's say you were awarded $100,000 and you said you were going to use 60 of it in payroll and 20 of it on rent and 20 of it on utilities. But in the end, you needed to use more of it on payroll. They are allowing a deviation of 10% to go between eligible categories, not new categories, between eligible categories. Anything outside that they make it sound like they're going to reject that use of funds. So you kind of have to really plan out how you are going to present, how you're going to use the money, and how much you're going to use in each one of the categories. And they are requesting that in advance. Next slide, please. Okay, the due date I've mentioned is April 8th. It's really important to get it done as early as possible towards that date, not too much later after that date. Next slide. This is also slides from yesterday's SBA that I took pictures of that I think are helpful when you're preparing evidentiary material, that you're going to be able to upload JPEGs, PDFs, XLS sheets. Another question that come in is, what are crosswalk sheets? Crosswalks are essentially Excel documents of rows and columns. And it's to kind of show, you know, I booked this talent on these days at these venues, and it's a cross tabulation of it so that they can see. That's all it is. And you can use Excel, and you can use Word docs as all things that you can upload. That's very helpful that they gave that information so that you know the kind of evidentiary materials that you want to have ready on April 8th to upload. Just remember, I know time is important, but complete application is even more important than timeliness. Okay, and then something that was a little hard to hear from the SBA is that they will not have any of their staff provide assistance for answering questions on the application and providing assistance on how to do it. That was really rough to hear because that seemed really cold, and for a brand new program that's very complex, they need to do that. And so unfortunately, it's not going to be available to us. I mean, they really put that out there to us yesterday. And they made that same point that I've been making, and that is that applications are not going to be considered received by the SBA until it's all submitted at once. But the good news is that you can save your work as you move along. It's just that I know that SAMS.gov system and program is a bear. So keep saving constantly. It also is kind of famous for just kind of like stopping because it gets overloaded, too many people using it at the same time. So just keep saving on a regular basis, really often, frequently. Next slide. Some of the documents that you definitely want to start getting ready are your corporate documents to show what kind of entity you are and when you started in business, to show that you've been in operation earlier. You need the government ID of whoever is going to sign this application, who represents the business or the nonprofit. It could be the CEO, it could be the board chairman as a talent rep, it could be just you, the entrepreneur. But you need, that it's really important. They made a big deal of this, that the government ID is very important. And they want you to provide an Excel list of all your employees, or it could be a Word document of all your employees, their job titles, when they started, whether they're considered full or part-time, whether they're still working there, a lot of information like that. They have said that they are keeping a lot of this private. I know for talent representatives this is really important because you're going to be sharing a lot of important confidential information of who you represent and fees and things like that. So they are going to keep that private, they said. So feel comfortable in supplying that information. Nonprofits, they're tax exempt. And then the written certification of need. which is really, it ended up being a very simple thing that they're looking for. That is, I'm just going to read you a sample that they had. 1 second. Okay, it's as basic as saying something like this. They use this as an example. Due to the uncertainty of current economic conditions, the SVOG grant is necessary to support the ongoing operations of our organization. And our organization opened its doors on November 19th, 1989, the first day you became operational. It is currently shuttered, but it intends to reopen on April 26, 2021. You don't have to use those dates, obviously. But here are the key points here, is that you're saying that you need the funds because of the pandemic. You're saying that you've been in business prior to February 15th, 2020, and it's been operational. And you're certifying that you intend to reopen, or that you've already opened partially, whatever the case is. You need to prove those points, and they want that in a certification. They didn't say, they said by just submitting that document, that is your signature that you agree with it. I don't think it hurts if you also had the same person who's providing the government ID to also sign that certification on the same document. The lawyer in me thinks that that's a better idea. Okay, next slide. And I think we are near our end. This is, these are standard forms that everyone's going to have to complete, that you're not going to use the money for construction projects. You have a drug-free workplace, that you haven't gotten into any kind of legal problems of disbarment and suspension and other things like that. You're not on their do not pay list of being someone who should never get money from the federal government because you're either dishonest, doing fraudulent things like that. And that there's also a certification that you're not going to use the funds for lobbying, and things like that. And then I think the last slide, next, yeah, is my, finally, this is going to be a lot of work on all of these elements. Don't give up. Don't get overwhelmed because of the bureaucracy, because it will lead to good funds to keep you afloat during this pandemic. All of us, South Arts, Americans for the Arts, lots of organizations out there who can help guide you through the federal relief process. Personally, I do office hours on Zoom every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern time, and you don't have to be a member. You can just pop in, ask questions, listen to other people's questions and answers, and learn from them. And I give you the URL for that at the end. When in doubt, apply. Let them tell you if you qualify or not. Be exact and answer every question and supply every document to make your case, to provide more than enough information and not just enough information. And apply as soon as possible because it's based on first come, first serve for all of these federal programs, except for your economic stimulus and child credit that you're guaranteed. That's it.
Whew, so everyone take a deep breath. Nina, you provided such amazingly useful information, and you did it with such grace and just offered such useful, juicy, meaty stuff. As we've shared with all of you who are still with us, the links, the documents will all be posted on our website. As well, Nina shared that the documents are also available on their website. Nina, would you give us that website address again?
Yeah, it is www.artsactionfund.org/COVID-19 resources.
Excellent. And Ivan has also put that in the chat. So again, many of you are hanging around and we thank you for that. What we're going to do is just continue. We're going to ask just a few questions to get them documented, and hang on if you like. If you must leave, we thank you so very much for your time. So let's get started with a few questions. So I'm going to start with the first one. Do PPP funds count as gross revenue?
No, it's not included in your revenue at all.
Excellent. And this is another about PPP funds. Will the PPP funds, the first round, count as that revenue if they're making an application for shuttered venues?
Nope, it will not.
All right. Do you have to have employees to apply?
No. PPP, you need employees to get money. Shuttered venues, you do not.
Excellent. Let's see. Do for-profit companies show PPP and EIDL as part of their gross revenue? And I think this is in reference to the shuttered venues.
Yep. The answer is no. No entity has to report PPP as either taxable income or gross revenue of any kind in a shuttered venue application.
Great. And you can, again, just to confirm, apply for shuttered venues even if you've received PPP or EIDL.
Yes, and I'll take it one step further. For those who applied for PPP before March, when the rule got changed, and you had to certify that you would not apply for a shuttered venue, the SBA will ignore that, and so can you, and you can still apply, and you're not breaching any contract.
That's great to hear. This is about PPP and loan forgiveness. What's necessary to get to loan forgiveness? Could you remind folks?
Yeah, it does depend on how much you got, and I'm assuming it's less than 2 million. So we're going to put you out of that category. And here are the bare minimums. One is you have to have used the money during the covered period that you select. And you can select anything between 8 weeks and 24 weeks. And then you have to be able to show, if asked, that you actually spent the money by following a trail of whether it's by check, a transfer, some kind of withdrawal of some sort, to spend at least 60% of that PPP money on payroll. If you're an entrepreneur, that means paying yourself. You need to show that you spent at least 60% on paying yourself and no more than 40% on other kinds of overhead. But you need a money trail. You need to show that it's paying for things and not just sitting in your bank account.
Excellent, excellent. Let's see. I have a question about talent agencies and booking artists. So what about those folks that are talent agents? They book artists for cruise ships. Do they apply? Mm-hmm. Okay. And so
I asked the SBA for this question and they gave it to me. And they ended up putting it into the FAQ too. If the key here is if the money that the talent agent is making is being reported to the on an American tax return, and if you're also booking them, now for a cruise ship, they're not booking them on American soil. Obviously, they're in international seas for the most part. It doesn't have to be, but a lot of them are on international seas. You're still reporting income because you are on American soil and you're reporting it on American tax return, that you're okay. You qualify.
Yes, yes. Let's see, for live venue operators, must the positions that work be W-2 workers?
No, no. Again, the counting of employees is just for purposes to figure out how small of a business you are. But when you go to show the money that you get from shuttered venue is not based on your expenses. It's based on 40% of your revenue. So it's not looking at your employee expenses and whether they're on payroll or not.
Excellent, excellent. So we've gotten through many of the questions. Ivan, did you see any that you believed needed addressing for the call, and others it seems as though could be addressed by another review of the presentation and review of the links?
We did have one person who was asking if you could remind them how to join your office hours on Friday.
Mm-hmm. So it's really through a link. We don't to get the Zoom information. And so you go to www.artsactionfund.org/office hours Nina.
And I just dropped that in the chat box for everybody as well, so that they have that.
Yeah, and then when you go there, you'll see what the Zoom link is. You press on that, and boom, you're in our Zoom room. That usually, I bill it as 1 hour, but it usually goes longer.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, so there is one more person that just says, please address. So let's go ahead and do that. Can we stagger PPP and PUA on alternate weeks?
No, you cannot do that. Your covered period for a PPP has to be continuous. So it's a minimum of 8 weeks is what I would say you go for. And the 8 weeks can't just begin any old time. It has to begin, first let me tell you what the default is, and then let me tell you how you can make it an alternative covered period. The default is the clock starts ticking the day it gets deposited into your checking account, the money. And the default is that's when your covered period begins. But when you go to your forgiveness form, it says you can have an alternative covered period, but it can't be just like anytime you want. It's got to be what they call the next reasonable normal pay period that you have. So let's say you've been on unemployment and that is your normal pay period right now. So it would be a natural time of when 1 full week ends, and before you begin that next week, you start going on PPP and you would stop certifying your unemployment for that week.
Very good. Well, the questions keep coming in. So Nina, how would you suggest some folks get some of these other questions answered? Should they join your office hours?
Sure, you can come to the office hours. I would also really appreciate it if I could, if you put in your question in the Q&A with an email address, I will try to see if I can get back to you that way. Otherwise, if you need it faster because the shuttered venues application is coming up, or you need to get a PPP application in, I would say come to my office hours on Friday.
Additionally, you'll be receiving an email in your inbox in about 15 minutes with a survey asking about your experience on this webinar. There is a comment box in there, so if you do have any additional questions for Nina, we will make sure that we pass that information along if you leave it in the comment box.
That's a great catch. Yes, Nina.
I see this one question. I heard Nina mention that the ARP covers all citizens' healthcare costs if they contract COVID. One of the things we are struggling with in projecting budgets for next year is that actors, equity unions recently released requirements stipulating an organization is 100% responsible for healthcare costs for equity artists who contract COVID during our employment. The implications are quite astronomical. How long does the coverage for all citizens? Okay, so the good news is ARP merely extended the coverage. The full coverage of COVID healthcare costs started with the CARES Act, so that you should have uninterrupted coverage. The portion that it covered didn't change. It's 100% coverage. So really what happens is the hospital, the doctors, nobody should be charging someone who comes in with COVID and they get reimbursed from the federal government.
Interesting. Well, now I'm seeing quite a few more questions coming in. My goodness, they're just popping up now. Clarify a presenter.
You know, Joy, something else that I'm going to offer myself for, if you want to
Okay.
take the offer, is why don't we just do not a presentation session, but a Q&A session?
I think that would be a great next step. Let's do a thumbs up to that. And let's get that scheduled, especially with shuttered venues opening on the 8th. So let's talk offline and get that going for our group. How about that?
Yeah. And if there's anything else that you think is really want to do right now, I can do that for a couple
Okay.
of minutes. Sure.
Ivan, any more questions you see that have not been addressed?
There is a request for clarification about whether grants count towards gross earned revenue or just gross revenue.
A grant would not be earned revenue of any kind, whether it's gross or regular earned.
Great. And people are asking if
put it in gross revenue, just regular gross revenue, a grant is included, but not if the word earned is in there, it's not included. If it's not in there, if it's just gross revenue, a grant would be included.
Thank you.
Unless it's a CARES Act grant or any of these like advances, EIDL advances and things like that.
Thank you. There are also questions if you know what time on April 8th the portal will open for SVOG applications.
They did not tell us that, but I don't know. I actually don't know. I don't even have a good guess based on the way they do things.
I see a quick question here. What is the difference between a performing arts organization operator and an artist? So an artist is a musical duo that operates under an LLC agreement and receives funds for creating art. Is the duo eligible for Shuttered Venues grant the same way as a performing arts organization operator? This would be similar to a dance company.
Mm-hmm. So if you are a business, so I'm going to read out loud the, I'm starting to think that you would be eligible, and use the motto I've been saying is don't disqualify yourself. If you even think you might be eligible, go for it. But let's see here. In terms of the definition of a live performing arts organization operator. By being an LLC, that makes you an organization. So we can check that one off. Now let's see if you fall into the other categories. It's an entity, including a theatrical management business, which meets the criteria established under the Economic Aid Act, which established shuttered venues, and whose principal business activity is to create, produce, perform, and/or present live performances, I assume you do that, for audiences in qualifying venues. So the places that you're performing are everything from a nightclub to a symphony hall to amphitheaters, concert halls, auditoriums, theaters, clubs, festivals, and schools. And if you fit one of those categories of where you perform, it seems like you're eligible. But remember, don't leave any doubt in the SBA's mind. You prove that you fit every single one of those categories. Because you're small, you're doubting yourself whether you're an organization. I can hear it in your question. So you give me all the proof you can that you are all of the elements of what defines a live performing arts organization. And then you'll do it. You'll get it.
So you do not have to have a permanent performance space to be eligible for shuttered venues.
Yes, that's the biggest myth to debunk.
And so that answers at least 4 questions I'm seeing here. And the next thing that people, I see several questions about, PPP is for W-2 employees.
That's correct.
And 1099 employees would apply for what kind of relief aid?
Okay, so there's a little confusion in the question I can see. So W-2 employees are important for the organization that applies for a PPP. A 1099 person can apply for a PPP directly for yourself because you are a business in and of yourself.
So it does not have any.
And actually, you know, in many ways, the 1099 gig worker, it's hard because you got to do all this bureaucracy and figure out all these things on your own. But the one thing that is a big benefit is you get multiple places to draw from. You can get, you are the only group that can get both a pandemic unemployment assistance and a PPP. The only ones that can get both. You just can't have them at the same time.
Very good. So I've got a free festival that doesn't have a ticket price, but the revenue comes from concessions, booth sales, etc. Would they be eligible for shuttered venue?
This is where it gets more iffy. Is the festival run by a nonprofit organization?
It doesn't say, but let's assume it does. Then
it does. It's a little bit easier because there's an exception for nonprofits that do mostly free events as long as the production value is done by professional people. Then they will allow it. Let's say you're not a nonprofit and you're still doing these free events and the way you're making money. Assuming if you're not a nonprofit, you have to be in some kind of business venture. You're trying to make money, and that you're making enough money from concessions. Then it becomes a little bit more iffy, but I would say that if you can show that you're doing the advertising in advance for people to come to the event, I think another criteria you might have to prove is whether you pay the performers. You didn't mention that in your question, but I think that is a criteria you're going to want to look at and prove. And that if you aren't charging ticket prices, you definitely have to promote the fact that maybe the price of entry is connected with the concessions. I don't know if that's possible.
right.
That might help too.
Okay. So that's really good information.
Even if it's iffy, I'd still apply.
Still apply, right. This is an interesting question. My LLC got the PPP loan and is dispersing it over 24-week period, this means that the employees are under their the general weekly unemployment threshold. So whatever they're paying their employees over this 24-week period means that whatever they're being paid puts them eligible, I guess, for unemployment. So with these reduced hours, could those employees go and claim unemployment? So it sounds like there is a difference between what they're being paid under PPP versus what they might have been paid outside of that. Yeah. And there's a reduction in pay. So would those employees be eligible for for unemployment?
So every state is different. And what this is really a question about is how much money can you make, can you earn while collecting unemployment? And it definitely is a case that every state their threshold of how much you can collect is vastly different from state to state. And so I can't give you a specific answer, but I can just say that that is one of the criteria you have to look into it. It's also not the organization's responsibility, it's the individual employee's responsibility to do it correctly. Because it's on them to have to report to the state. They cannot hide it. They have to report to the state that they are earning money from an organization. And they have to report how much they're making. And it will be up to that state to say, well, you've gone over the maximum amount that you can make this week, so you have to take a pass. And we'll see what happens next week. And then if it keeps happening for a certain number of consistent weeks, again, depending on every state, it's different, they will say, we're kicking you out of the system until you're fully unemployed again. In terms of the organization, you're reporting this. I mean, if they are an employee, you have to report this to your state employment offices, and you're paying unemployment insurance still on these people. So eventually they are going to connect the dots, but if also as a PPP did, when you requested the money from the bank to say you want to keep employing these people, a question that I would have you think about as an organization in terms of your responsibility is, in order to get full forgiveness, is there a certain number of hours that have been reduced so much so that it would compromise your ability to get full forgiveness? Because it's they don't like it when hours have been reduced more than 25%. It jeopardizes how much you can get forgiveness. And therefore, then you're stuck with a situation where you don't get all that money for his grant. You might have a percentage of it left over where it's actually a loan that you have to pay back. Now, the good news is it's very good terms, only 1% interest over, depending on when you got your PPP. If you got it before June 11th, it's a 2-year loan. Anything after June 11th is a 5-year loan, both at 1% interest.
It's an excellent opportunity for sure for many other, so many organizations. Here's another question that's just begging for an answer. Since round 2 PPP is so much more generous, how do we calculate the maximum salary payment allowed to be paid on a weekly basis?
Yeah, so so once you get to how much you can make, so it's ultimately based on your gross revenue from the previous year. So you're within limits already. So let's say, and you should also know that any self-employed person doing the Schedule C PPP, the maximum annualized salary that anyone can have is $100,000. And it's also based on previous years. So you can't say I'm going to pay myself for the first time $100,000 in 2020 and 21. It has to be based on whether you paid yourself 2019, reported it on your tax return, that you had gross revenue higher, 100,000 or higher. But if your line 8B says 100,000 or more than 100,000, they're still not going to let you use more than 100,000. They're going to cap it at 100,000. So let's work with that. It's 100,000. You divide it by 12 months, and then you multiply it by 2.5, and that's the total amount that you're eligible for. And if I'm not mistaken, we're going to do it right now. 100,000 divided by 12 is 8,333, and then you multiply it by 2.5. And you get this magic number that you see a lot, and that is $20,833. That is, if you make that amount of money, that is what you can pay yourself. And if you are going for a covered period where you want to use as, let's say you want to use 100% of that loan on paying yourself, then you can't take 8 weeks. And the reason why is because this is based on 2.5 months of salary, and 8 weeks is based on 2 months of salary. And it would make your weekly salary more than $100,000 annualized. for someone making that much money, you have to use a portion of it on overhead in order to meet the minimum 8 weeks. And this is only applicable to those of you who are close to that 100,000 range. It doesn't matter with less. You can still meet, you can get the job done in 8 weeks. But if you are close to that 100,000 range, then you got to do it in 11 weeks. And you can use 100% of it paying yourself. And the way you do it is you divide $20,833 by 11 weeks, divide by 11. And now what you're going to do is essentially pay yourself $1,894 per week. Pretty good. And you'll just write yourself a check or transfer the money between accounts, a business account to a personal account, anything like that. And you will be forgiven for all of that money. All that application is only if you're close to 100,000 though.
Right, and so the advice is to don't count yourself out, right? Go ahead and make the applications. We've got lots of questions still about what lines to use. So for PPP2, what line? 31 or 8?
8. If you're a Schedule C, only if you are a business that files a Schedule C. So that means you're a 1099 worker, you're an entrepreneur, you could be an LLC that still does a Schedule C. If you're in one of those categories, do not use line 31 anymore. That's what you were asked to do in 2020 and the first 2 months of 2021. Do not use that anymore. And now you're going to use line 7 on Schedule C for your gross income. And you're going to get a lot more money.
And then someone is asking about filling out form 4506T.
Mm-hmm.
If it wasn't completed correctly, it would be rejected. Is there any clarification on this form 4506T?
If you didn't fill it out correctly, it would be rejected. So what this is, okay, so for those who don't know, 4506T is the form that the SBA requests that gives them permission to get an actual copy of your last known tax return from the IRS directly, so that they can rely on that being your last known filed document. You need to do that to get an EIDL loan, to get an SVOG, to get, I think you needed to get a PPP as well. And what you're telling me is that you filled it out incompletely or incorrectly, and you're probably stuck. They're probably not giving you a loan because things don't match up, right?
Correct. That's what I'm gathering from this question.
So if you've been officially rejected, no, I'm going to phrase it a different way. If you haven't been rejected yet and it's just kind of stale, then you ask your lender to cancel your application. And then you file a new application, whether it's with the same lender or a different lender. I know that's an option. If you've been officially rejected, I believe you're not allowed to apply again. And that's just based on memory of reading an FAQ a long time ago.
Okay.
I think, so there's a possibility you might be able to reapply, but my instinct is telling me that it means you can't reapply because you've been officially rejected by the SBA.
So the word to the wise is make sure that your documentation and all the forms that you're completing align with being able to locate your organization and its tax filings or your own personal tax.
There's one thing I can add to this that reminds me that my instincts are correctly remembering it.
Mm-hmm.
That I helped someone through my office hours who had an EIDL loan, and he did a preliminary Schedule C because it was early in the tax year and he hadn't filed yet, but he just wanted to get the loan going. So he gave them a preliminary tax return. When the SBA went to go get his formally filed tax return, it was off by about 43 cents, I believe. Really, no, not cents, $8.43. And he dropped to 43 cents. It was off by $8. And they originally told him they were not going to give him the EIDL loan. And so he appealed the process. It still kind of got stuck idly, and they gave him one more opportunity to appeal, and he had to get it right, because if he did not win the appeal and it was rejected, it ends all opportunity for another request for a loan. And we got his member of Congress involved. And they were actually, and that's something I always recommend. If you're getting stalled with unemployment or any EIDL loans, anything like that, members of Congress have dedicated staff in each one of their offices to help their constituents through the process. So you want to take advantage of that. And what you end up doing is giving them rights to be able to be your representative in negotiating this with the EIDL, with the SBA. And he got that, and he gave that permission. And what they found out is that there was this $8 discrepancy. And so they were able to resubmit and explain the correction, and it went through, and he got his EIDL loan.
Well, with that, we are just a few minutes after 6 o'clock, and we're going to wrap up this section, this time together. But it sounds as though we need another round of just question and answer, Nina. So maybe we can do a South Arts version of office hours with Nina. How about that? Well, again, thank you so very much for joining us. And the recording and information will be available online very soon. And you all have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.